Good afternoon. During his ministry, Jesus once asked Peter, "Who do you say that I am?" Well, how would you answer that question? Who is God for you? It turns out that people answer that question many different ways. See, the real debate about God in the United States today isn't about whether or not we believe in him or not. According to the pollsters, only 5% of Americans are atheists. And let's face it, you rarely see 95% of Americans agree about anything. These same pollsters say that for 73% of Americans, religion is either an important or a very important part of their life. But there is a wide variation about who this God is that Americans say they believe in. About 33% of us say that God is a higher power or a spiritual force. And about 56% of Americans believe in a God who, as he is described in the Bible. Back in 2010, a book was published called America's Four Gods: What We Say About God and What That Says About Us. Now, I'll admit, I did not read this book, but I've read summaries and reviews of it. The book is based on surveys that were done in 2005 and 2007, surveys in which more than 3,000 people responded. The authors of this book concluded that how you understand God says more about your viewpoints, your politics, what you think about social issues, than your gender, your class, your race, your income, your education, your political affiliation. The book, America's Four Gods, is based on the answers to two questions. First, to what extent does God interact with the world? And second, to what extent does God judge the world? Answering those questions can come up with a chart based on the nature of God, is he judgmental or not, and the activity of God, does he engage in the world or not? And so the chart can end up with saying God is judgmental, meaning he punishes people for breaking the rules, or God is non-judgmental, he intervenes to help. And we can say that God is engaged or actively present in the world, or he's disengaged, meaning he has little or no activity in the world now, and maybe eventually in the afterlife he will. So based on these two questions, you can divide Americans' belief about God into four categories. First is the authoritative God, that is a God who is judgmental and who is engaged in the world. It turns out about 31% of Americans believe in this authoritative God. About half of evangelical Christians do, and it's what white men tend to believe. The authoritative God is a God who causes both good and bad things to happen in the world. God punishes those who fail to obey his law, and God is loving, they believe, but God expresses his love through discipline. Those who believe in an authoritative God tend to be pretty absolutist or black and white in their thinking. Second, there are those who believe in a benevolent God, that is, a God who is active in the world, but who is non-judgmental. This is the God that about 24% of Americans believe in, and it's what women apparently tend to believe in. This is the God who intervenes in the world to help us. This is the God who loves us and who expresses his love by taking care of us. People who believe in a benevolent God, by the way, tend to be more upbeat in their thinking. Next, we come to the critical God. This is the God that about 16% of Americans believe in, and apparently it's what African Americans tend toward. The critical God is a God who keeps track of our sin and a God who will punish us for our sin. But he's not going to punish us through events in this world. He's not going to have a tornado or lightning bolt strike your house. No, he will reserve his punishment in the afterlife because he's not active in the world today. And then finally we come to the distant God. This is the God who is not judgmental and who isn't engaged in the world. About 24% of Americans believe in this kind of a God, And the believers in a distant God tend to have more education than the other three groups. These are the people who rarely speak about miracles or about God's judgment. For them, God is more like a cosmic force who created the world, who set up the laws of nature, but now doesn't intervene at all. Now, in reality, there are certainly more than 4 ways to understand who God is. You could be more or less extreme in each category. For example, you might believe that God is judgmental, but maybe you think he's only a little bit judgmental rather than really judgmental. Or you can believe that God is engaged in the world, but doesn't do a lot, versus he really does an awful lot. If the researchers would have asked different questions, we probably would have come up with different categories. So where do you find yourself on this chart? I personally would believe in a benevolent God, a God who is active in the world and who is primarily active to help us. Although I guess I probably tend a little bit toward the judgmental, because there are times that I do believe God does punish people. But primarily, I believe in a non-judgmental God. How about you? Where would you put yourself on this chart? That may be helpful as you consider your own understanding of God, and it might help you understand other people because they look at God differently from how you do. Thinking about the way that you understand God may also help you deal with difficult feelings you may have when God doesn't seem to act the way that you expect him to. For example, maybe you believe that God is engaged in the world, but you don't see him intervene. Or maybe you think that God helps people, but you're troubled by the fact that you're not experiencing his help in your own life. Would you pray with me, please? Lord, teach us who you are. Teach us what your character is like. Teach us how you are active in the world. And help us, Lord, as we are interacting with one another, to recognize that not everyone sees you the same way that we do. Help us, Lord, to hone our understanding of who you are more and more in the way in which you are described, in the way in which you have revealed yourself through Scripture. Amen. Thanks for joining me. We'll talk again later.